Thank you, John and Julie, for reading for us today. I hope you're all in the mood for a grandma story because that's where we're starting this morning. My grandmother was a prodigious gardener. My grandmother's yard was a bit of a wonderland for me as a child. And my grandmother had the most incredible, fragrant wild roses growing in her yard that I have ever seen or smelled in my lifetime. But among those roses, there was also this nefarious little weed that she called the strangleweed. And every summer, my grandmother went to war with strangleweed. She would pull it, cut it, dig it. She would work at it until her hands were red and scraped and sometimes bleeding, but she persisted year after year after year, pulling that darn strangleweed every time it showed its ugly little head. She was like Antoine Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, protecting his beloved rose from the baobabs growing on his little planet. Grandma pulled those weeds every single time she walked past and spotted one. She never missed a beat. And she made it clear to me when I walked around with her that you either pull these weeds or they'll kill the roses. After Sean and I took over my grandmother's house, years later, of course, there were a few summers that I was not quite as diligent as my grandmother in pulling out the strangleweeds. I dare say she had much more energy than I do. And I lost some of the roses. There are now some bare patches where the weeds have taken over. The roses are still there, even now as I live in New York, the roses are still there, but I'm not sure that anyone will ever defend those roses the way my grandmother did. We hear this morning the parable of the sower. This is a popular, often read parable. But as I was reading it over the last week and a half, this memory of Grandma was popping into my mind, her battle with the baobabs, the strangleweed. And I started to see this particular parable in a new way, which is kind of exciting for parables that are often spoken of frequently. But the reality is that I've developed some problems with this parable, and I'm not sure that I see it in quite the positive light that I used to, I guess. But first, there's this sower fella who strikes me as a bit of a careless guy. He appears to be dropping seeds all over the place and not getting them where they're supposed to be. So we have this kind of careless gardener just running around dropping seeds. The seeds have no say in where they fall. They have no say in where they end up. They were at the mercy of this guy who was supposed to be planting them in the right place in the first place. And where do they end up, these seeds dropping all over the place? Well, some of them end up on this path, and the birds immediately swoop down and eat them up. Anyone who's tried to plant grass seed has seen this happen, right? If you don't cover it up, the birds come and they eat the seeds. Other seeds ended up on rocks, unprotected, unable to form deep roots. And so they tasted life for a second, only to wither and die in the scorching sun. Some of the seeds ended up amongst the baobabs, the thorns, and they are overtaken and they are choked by these strangling thorny weeds. Some by chance happened to fall on good soil, and their lives were great, and they got to bear fruit. Jesus, of course, as he does with parables, offers us the interpretation. He explains what it means for these seeds to be falling in these various places. And he talks about the seeds that fall on the path being those who hear the word but do not really get it. And so their faith is snatched away from them, in Jesus's words, by the evil one before it ever has a chance to take root in the heart. The seeds on the rocky ground are people who hear the word with initial enthusiasm, kind of a shallow enthusiasm, but their faith is rootless and cannot endure challenges and difficulties. And so their shallow joy is easily scorched away by the sun is easily uprooted. The seeds that fall among the thorns, they might begin to develop and grow. They might grow up for a moment, but the seed is seized by a world. The faith is seized by a world filled with sorrow and defined by greed and hurt. And of course, there's those happy seeds that get to live in a good soil place, and they get to grow and they get to bear fruit. I'm not going to lie, this parable bugs me. And it bugs me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's carelessness. It's the carelessness of the sower that bothers me. The careless way our imperiled seeds are just randomly dropped in places. I used to think that the point of this parable was pretty straightforward, right? You scatter seeds and you hope that some of those seeds find good soil, and you pray that someone somewhere will hear the word and they will be inspired and they will grow and they will bear fruit. They will be the good soil. I used to think that the church was called to find that good soil, that perfect place, that willing soul to accept and receive the word, to plant our messages in the deep and the rich soil, to plant our churches. Planting churches is the subject of many, many books these days. And then I started to think about my grandmother pulling at those weeds that were always coming back. No matter how hard she pulled, no matter how often she pulled, those weeds still came back. And I thought about those beloved roses and how those roses were growing in the worst possible place. The weeds were there, but she was determined to make her roses safe. She was determined to make the bad soil good. The seeds that fell on the path didn't ask to be there. In fact, the path itself didn't ask to be there. The path was created by people who either built it deliberately or just never bothered to consider walking somewhere else. And so they trampled the ground so much, it became hard and barren and unable to grow things. The path covered up potentially good soil, trampled down for the convenience of the people who walk on the path. The path could have been moved. The seeds on the path could have been moved. The path itself could have been tilled up. The seeds could have been protected. The seeds could have been relocated. The seeds could have been noticed before they stayed on the path so that the birds or the evil one could snatch them away. But the sower never bothered to notice them. The sower wasn't that concerned about where the seeds were falling in the first place. The seeds on the rocky ground didn't ask to be there, to suddenly have to grow in a place filled with challenges and threats to their life. Nobody told them how hard it was going to be, how much their faith would be challenged, how much their faith would cost them for daring to accidentally try to grow among the rocks. Everything seemed fine to them for a moment. They got to grow for a moment. And we all know how it ends for them. And maybe there is good soil under those rocks, and maybe nobody bothered to look for it. The seeds aren't supposed to be there, so it's just their tough luck trying to grow among the rocks. And who among us cannot relate to those poor seeds choked by the thorns? They didn't ask to be there either. They didn't know that the world they were going to try to grow in was so dangerous, so broken, that there were greedier plants, that there were more competitive plants who would try to overwhelm and overtake them. They didn't know that their faith was going to be strangled by the appetites and the ambitions of others. They tried to grow with nobody protecting them from the thorns. We were too busy looking for the best soil, too busy celebrating the same forces and appetites that ultimately strangled the life out of those poor seeds. Those seeds didn't have my grandmother tirelessly working to free them from the strangleweed, from the thorns. My grandma taught me something that was ultimately reinforced by what I have come to learn both about farmers and about less careless gardeners who work with care and intention on the things that they grow. Sometimes, when you can't find good soil, you have to make it good. You clear the rocks and you pull the thorns. You make sure pathways are clear. You make sure at least your pathways are not intrusive to the things you are trying to love and grow. You feed the soil. You nurture the seeds. And you love every single square foot of soil, the good and the bad. The church has a lot to learn about growing things. And perhaps we should start listening to the experts who actually know how to do it. We are a people in constant search for the best soil, always looking for good soil, always overlooking the seeds that we are dropping along the way. We are careless gardeners, the church, never considering what lies just below the surface of the thorns or the rocks, the good soil that might be underneath all those challenges to us. We don't even like to talk about the rocks and the thorns, quite frankly. We don't like to talk about the fact that faith also has challenges. Faith is also about sacrifice. Faith is challenging. We often trod the same path back and forth, making sure that we are consistent, making sure that we are constantly following the same routines over and over again. And all that we do is make the path less and less fruitful and more worn down so that nothing can grow there. We are so intently focused on finding some tiny space of good soil that we never notice the fallen seeds trying desperately to grow in very dangerous places. We are careless gardeners, the church. My grandmother taught me a lesson. She taught me a lesson about sowing and growing. And my grandmother always taught practical lessons, lessons that could be spoken bluntly. If a weed is threatening to choke the flower, pull it. If a rock is in the way, move it. And if you dig deep enough, if you try hard enough, sometimes you find out you've been walking on top of the good soil the whole time. Amen.